You ever notice how we sit inside a heated house wrapped in 2 blankets, fuzzy socks on, and we're still complaining about the cold? Meanwhile, 400 years ago, an Arctic nomad elder was sleeping in a skin tent on the open tundra, wind screaming at 80 kilometers per hour, temperature at minus 48 degrees Celsius, snow piling against the tent walls, and he wakes up like it's just another day. No thermostat, no electric blanket, no insulated walls, just animal skins, seal oil, and knowledge that had been refined through thousands of winters where getting it wrong meant your entire family was dead by morning. And here's what makes this even more incredible. Those Arctic winters weren't occasional extreme events. They were 6 to 8 months of continuous cold every single year. Families didn't just survive them, they slept through them in tents that to modern eyes look like they shouldn't protect anyone from anything. But instead of freezing to death, they stayed warm enough to sleep deeply, to rest, to wake up ready for another day in conditions that would kill a modern person with expensive gear within hours. So the million-dollar question is, how did they pull this off? Because if most of us got dropped in the Arctic with the best modern camping equipment money can buy, we'd be hypothermic before the first night ended. But Arctic nomads, Inuit, Sami, Nenets, Chukchi, turned brutal Arctic winters into a system. A complete survival system so effective that families thrived for generations in temperatures that should make human life impossible. Before we reveal exactly how Arctic nomads slept in winter tents at temperatures down to minus 50 degrees Celsius without freezing to death, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if stories of extreme survival fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to learn will make you question everything you think you know about cold, about shelter, and about what actually keeps humans alive when winter becomes deadly. Imagine this, an Arctic nomad family 400 years ago setting up camp as winter darkness descends. The sun won't rise above the horizon for another 2 months. The temperature is already minus 35 degrees Celsius and dropping. Wind is building. And they have one absolutely critical decision to make: where to position the tent. Pick wrong and the entire family could be dead before morning. Not uncomfortable. Not cold. Dead. They weren't guessing. They were reading the landscape like experts whose ancestors had been making this exact decision for thousands of years, where every mistake in that lineage was eliminated by the death of the family that made it. First rule: never camp in the open. The Arctic wind doesn't just make you cold, it strips heat from your body so fast that exposed skin freezes solid in under 2 minutes. But position your tent behind a ridge, a rock formation, or even a snowdrift, and suddenly you have a windbreak that can reduce wind velocity by 50% or more. That wind reduction isn't comfort. It's the difference between surviving the night and dying from hypothermia even inside your tent with a fire burning. Because at minus 45 degrees Celsius with 60 km/h wind, the wind chill equivalent is near minus 70 degrees Celsius, and no tent in history can protect you from that without wind protection. Rock faces and cliff walls worked like thermal batteries. During the brief daylight hours in early and late winter, exposed rock absorbed what little solar radiation was available. Through the long night, that rock slowly released stored heat. Smart families positioned tents close enough to benefit from this radiant warmth but far enough that they weren't at risk from ice or rockfall. But you had to know what you were doing. Set up in a valley bottom and you'd be sleeping in the coldest air available, because cold air is denser and flows downhill like water, pooling in the lowest spots. Those frost pockets could be 10 to 15 degrees colder than locations just 20 meters higher in elevation. That temperature difference meant survival versus death. And fuel. Fuel wasn't optional. It was life itself. In the high Arctic there was no wood, no trees, no brush. Just whatever you'd brought with you: seal blubber, whale oil, maybe some dried willow or heather gathered during the brief summer. Run out of fuel in the middle of an Arctic winter storm and you weren't just cold. You were finished. Families chose camp locations partly based on access to any available fuel sources and on wind protection that would reduce how much fuel they'd need to burn. This was survival site selection. Location, location, location. And in the Arctic, the wrong location didn't just mean discomfort. It meant your children, your elders, your entire family could freeze where they slept. Talk about high-stakes real estate. Now picture this: a tent made of caribou and seal skins stretched over a frame of driftwood and bone, sitting in the middle of the frozen Arctic. Inside, an elder tends a small seal oil lamp that's producing a flame maybe 15 centimeters long. Sounds insane, right? Trying to heat a space with a flame smaller than a candle when it's minus 50 degrees Celsius outside? But here's the thing, it worked. And it didn't just barely work. It kept entire families warm enough to sleep through the night in comfort, not just barely clinging to survival. The lamp wasn't trying to heat air directly, because heating air at these temperatures with the limited fuel available was impossible. Instead, the lamp was a qulliq, a shallow soapstone bowl filled with seal blubber with a wick of dried moss burning along one edge. This wasn't a fireplace. It was a precision heating instrument that had been refined over thousands of years. The soapstone bowl mattered enormously. Soapstone has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. The burning wick heated the stone, and the stone became a radiant heater that warmed the tent not through hot air but through infrared radiation. Your body felt the warmth directly from the glowing stone even though the air temperature remained cold. The lamp burned continuously but at carefully managed intensity. Too large a flame consumed fuel at rates that would exhaust the winter supply. Too small a flame didn't provide adequate heat. The perfect flame size was knowledge, learned through watching your mother and grandmother tend lamps through your entire childhood, understanding by feel and observation exactly how large the flame needed to be. The positioning of the lamp inside the tent was calculated. It sat on the floor or on a low platform position so its radiant heat reached the sleeping platform and the central area where people spent time. The flame side faced the sleeping area, directing maximum heat where it was most needed. But the lamp created a problem that could kill as efficiently as the cold: moisture and smoke. The burning blubber produced water vapor. The tent's occupants produced moisture through breathing. And in a sealed tent at -50 degrees Celsius, that moisture had to go somewhere or it would condense and freeze on the interior walls, destroying the insulation and creating an ice shell that made everything worse. The solution was ventilation so precisely calibrated that modern HVAC engineers would be impressed. At the peak of the tent, a small opening remained partially open. The warm air from the lamp and from breathing rose through natural convection and exited through this opening. Fresh cold air entered at ground level through deliberate gaps left in the bottom seal. This created a continuous gentle air exchange. The incoming cold air was denser and flowed along the floor toward the lamp, where it was warmed, absorbed moisture, and rose to exit through the peak. The system was self-regulating. If the lamp burned hotter, it created stronger convection that pulled in more fresh air. If the lamp burned low, the air exchange slowed. But someone had to manage the system actively. The person tending the lamp, usually an experienced adult, watched the flame constantly, trimmed the wick to prevent smoking, adjusted the blubber supply, and observed condensation patterns on the tent walls to know if ventilation needed adjustment. Too much ventilation and heat escaped too fast. Too little and moisture accumulated or carbon monoxide built up to dangerous levels. This wasn't set it and forget it. This was continuous technical management of a life support system where mistakes meant everyone sleeping in the tent dying before morning. Here's something most people never think about: the cold doesn't just come from the air. It comes from the ground. Sleep directly on frozen ground and your body loses heat through conduction so fast that no amount of covering can compensate. Within hours, your core temperature drops and you're dying of hypothermia even if the air around you is survivable. Arctic nomads understood this completely. The tent floor was never just the ground. It was an engineered thermal barrier built from materials that interrupted heat conduction from sleeping bodies into the frozen earth below. First came the base layer, woven mats made from available plant materials, grass, reeds, willow bark, creating a layer that trapped air pockets. Air is insulation's best friend because it conducts heat very slowly, and if the air can't move through convection, heat transfer nearly stops. On top of the mats came the primary insulation, caribou or reindeer hides positioned fur side up. Caribou fur is hollow. Each individual hair is an air-filled tube. Thousands of these hollow hairs create an insulation layer whose thermal resistance approaches modern synthetic materials. The fur faced upward so sleeping bodies pressed into it, compressing it slightly and creating intimate contact that eliminated air gaps while still maintaining the insulation value. Multiple hides were layered. The sleeping platform might have 8 to 12 centimeters of caribou fur creating a barrier between bodies and ground. This wasn't luxury. This was engineering that prevented conductive heat loss that would otherwise kill sleeping people within hours. Some Arctic cultures added another element: heated stones wrapped in hide and placed under the sleeping furs. These stones, warmed near the lamp during the evening, provided supplemental heat that radiated upward through the sleeping platform. A properly heated stone could maintain useful warmth for 6 to 8 hours, extending the heating effect of the lamp through the sleeping period. The sleeping platform was positioned to receive maximum benefit from the lamp's radiant heat. It was raised slightly off the floor, elevating sleepers above the coldest air layer that settled at ground level. The platform was positioned so the lamp's radiation reached it directly, creating a zone where radiant heating and conductive insulation combined to maintain survivable sleeping temperatures. And when things got truly brutal, when temperatures dropped below -50 degrees Celsius and wind was attacking the tent with full force, Arctic nomads had additional strategies that seem extreme until you understand they were the difference between survival and death. Here's the thing about Arctic survival. Your body is your primary heater, and managing that heat is everything. Arctic nomad families didn't spread out to sleep like modern people do. They packed together tight, bodies pressed against bodies, creating a collective thermal mass that was warmer than any individual could maintain alone. Picture it: grandmother in the center, children pressed against her on both sides, parents forming an outer ring. This wasn't random. This was thermal geometry where the most vulnerable members, those who generated the least heat or lost it fastest, were positioned in the center where they received warmth radiating from multiple bodies simultaneously. The sleeping arrangement was intimate and complete. Bodies touched continuously. Arms and legs intertwined. The goal was eliminating any air gaps between family members because air gaps allowed heat to escape. The tight packing created a shared thermal environment where each person's body heat contributed to the warmth experienced by everyone else. The covering over this sleeping cluster was substantial. Caribou skin sleeping robes large enough to enclose multiple people were positioned fur side down so the sleepers were inside a fur envelope. Multiple robes layered on top created insulation thickness that could reach 15 to 20 centimeters of caribou fur above the sleeping family. The layering didn't stop with the sleeping robes. Arctic nomads understood that the clothing you wore while sleeping was as critical as the bedding you slept under. And here's what surprises modern people. They didn't undress for sleep the way we do. They added layers. Every piece of clothing worn during the day stayed on. The inner layer, soft caribou or seal skin worn fur side against the body, remained because it was already warmed by body heat accumulated through the day. Removing it would waste that stored warmth and require the body to spend metabolic energy warming cold fabric from scratch. Over the day clothing came additional sleeping layers. Extra caribou skin pants went over the day pants. Additional upper body garments were added. The parka stayed on, hood up, covering the head completely except for a small opening around the face for breathing. This might seem excessive until you understand that the head represents disproportionate heat loss. Blood flow to the brain is constant and the head surface area relative to its mass means it radiates heat faster than any other body part. Mittens stayed on hands even during sleep. Feet were wrapped in additional fur or grass insulation before being inserted into sleeping boots or fur bags specifically designed for sleep. Extremities lose heat fastest and are most vulnerable to frostbite, so they received dedicated protection beyond what the general bedding provided. The total effect was a person wearing full Arctic day gear plus additional layers, enclosed in fur sleeping robes, pressed against other similarly clothed family members, all positioned on an insulated platform receiving radiant heat from the lamp. This multi-layer system created nested thermal zones, each one warmer than the one outside it, until at the core, pressed against another person's body inside multiple fur layers, the temperature was warm enough for sleep. But clothing and bedding created their own problem: moisture. Human bodies produce moisture constantly through breathing and through minimal perspiration even in extreme cold. In a sleeping arrangement where multiple people were enclosed in layers of fur that were specifically designed to trap air and prevent air movement, moisture could accumulate to levels that destroyed the insulation's effectiveness. Wet fur loses most of its insulation value because water conducts heat far faster than air. A caribou hide that was dry and fluffy, trapping air in thousands of hollow hairs, could become damp and matted, its thermal resistance dropping by 60 to 70%. If the sleeping furs became wet from accumulated moisture, the family would wake up colder than they should be, and over multiple nights the problem would compound until the bedding was useless. Arctic nomads managed this through understanding moisture behavior that was accurate even without modern scientific vocabulary. Caribou fur has a structure that allows moisture vapor to migrate through it slowly. Water molecules can pass between the hollow hairs, moving from areas of high humidity, inside the sleeping bundle, toward areas of lower humidity, the tent interior. This migration only worked if there was a humidity gradient, if the tent interior was drier than the sleeping bundle. This is why the ventilation system was so critical. The continuous gentle air exchange pulled moisture out of the tent, maintaining interior humidity at levels lower than the sleeping area, which drove moisture migration from the bedding outward. But this process was slow, and some moisture inevitably accumulated in the sleeping furs overnight. Arctic nomads addressed this through daily maintenance. On any day when weather permitted, when temperature was above -30 degrees Celsius, when wind was manageable, when any sunlight was available, the sleeping furs were taken outside and aired. The dry Arctic cold and any available sun would sublimate accumulated moisture from the furs, restoring their loft and insulation value. This wasn't optional maintenance. It was essential to keeping the sleeping system functional. Families that neglected this fur maintenance found their sleeping furs becoming progressively damp and ineffective, creating a downward spiral where each night was colder than the last. The sleeping platform positioning within the tent followed principles that maximized warmth while maintaining safety. The platform was never directly adjacent to the tent wall, because the wall was the coldest surface in the entire structure. Cold radiated inward from the frozen tent covering, and positioning sleeping people against this cold surface would have created uncomfortable cold spots and increased heat loss. Instead, the platform was positioned in the tent's interior zone where it received maximum radiant heat from the lamp while being insulated from the cold walls by an air gap. This air gap was essential. Still air is an excellent insulator, and the space between the sleeping platform and the tent wall created a thermal buffer that reduced radiant heat loss from sleeping bodies toward the cold exterior. The lamp was positioned carefully relative to the sleeping platform. Too close and the radiant heat would be uncomfortably intense, potentially causing burns or creating hot spots that disrupted sleep. Too far and the platform wouldn't receive adequate radiant heating. The optimal distance was learned through experience, typically 1 to 2 meters, close enough for effective radiant heating but far enough for safety and comfort. Children and elders received special positioning that reflected accurate understanding of their greater vulnerability. Children were positioned in the absolute center of the sleeping cluster, surrounded by adult bodies on all sides. This created the warmest possible sleeping environment, with each child receiving radiant warmth from multiple adults simultaneously while being completely shielded from any cold air that might infiltrate from the tent edges. Elders were positioned adjacent to the healthiest adults, receiving supplemental warmth from high-output metabolisms while being protected from the colder edge positions. The adults who slept at the sleeping cluster's edges, the positions facing the tent walls where cold was greatest, were the healthiest and highest metabolism individuals who could tolerate more cold stress without danger. This strategic positioning wasn't sentimental. It was calculated thermal management based on accurate knowledge of who generated the most heat, who needed the most heat, and how to arrange bodies to maximize survival for everyone. A family that positioned people randomly without regard to thermal considerations would lose vulnerable members to cold stress that proper positioning would have prevented. The overnight routine required vigilance that modern people sleeping in heated bedrooms never experience. Someone had to remain partially alert throughout the night, monitoring the lamp to ensure it maintained adequate flame without burning too hot or producing dangerous smoke. This watch duty rotated among capable adults. The person with the watch would wake periodically, every 2 to 3 hours, to check the lamp, add blubber if the fuel level was low, trim the wick if the flame was smoking, and verify that everyone in the sleeping cluster remained adequately warm. They would check that coverings hadn't shifted to create gaps where cold could infiltrate. They would verify that the ventilation system was functioning correctly, that moisture wasn't condensing excessively on tent walls, that the air quality remained safe. This monitoring came at a cost. The watching adult sacrificed deep restorative sleep. But the alternative, sleeping deeply while the lamp went out or while a family member developed hypothermia or while carbon monoxide accumulated, was unacceptable. The watch duty was understood as the price of ensuring everyone survived until morning. The toll of maintaining this vigilance through a 6-month Arctic winter was substantial. Adults became chronically sleep-deprived, catching deep sleep only during their off-watch periods. But this was preferable to the alternative that every Arctic family knew from stories passed down through generations. Families found frozen in their tents because the lamp had gone out or had been managed incorrectly and no one had noticed until it was too late. When temperatures dropped to their absolute extremes, below -50 degrees Celsius, with wind creating conditions equivalent to -70 degrees Celsius or lower, Arctic nomads employed additional measures that seem extreme until you understand they were necessary for survival. Animal fat was rubbed directly onto exposed skin surfaces, primarily the face, which had to remain partially uncovered for breathing. This fat created a physical barrier that blocked wind from reaching the skin and eliminated wind chill at the skin surface. Buffalo or seal tallow was thick enough to stay in place through the night, providing protection that prevented frostbite on facial skin that couldn't be covered completely. The fat was sometimes mixed with ash from the lamp, creating a paste that had additional heat retention properties. The carbon particles in ash absorb radiant heat and hold it against the skin, creating a layer that actively retained warmth rather than simply blocking cold. This paste was applied to cheeks, foreheads, and around the eyes, the facial areas most exposed and most vulnerable to frostbite. For children, this application was done by adults who ensured complete coverage with no gaps that would leave skin unprotected. The goal wasn't aesthetics or tradition. The goal was preventing tissue damage that would impair function and could become life-threatening through infection in an environment where even minor injuries could prove fatal. Heated stones played an expanded role on the coldest nights. Multiple stones were heated throughout the evening and were wrapped in hides and positioned throughout the sleeping cluster, near children's feet, against elders' backs, near anyone showing signs of struggling with the cold. These stones provided supplemental localized heating that helped the most vulnerable members maintain core temperature when the lamp's radiant heat and shared body heat weren't quite adequate alone. The morning routine when the family woke revealed whether the night's thermal management had been successful. If everything had been executed correctly, family members woke feeling rested rather than exhausted from fighting cold all night. Children woke active and responsive rather than lethargic from cold stress. Elders woke without the stiffness and reduced function that deep cold exposure created. The sleeping furs were checked for moisture accumulation. Excessive dampness indicated ventilation problems that needed to be addressed before the next night. The lamp fuel supply was assessed to ensure adequate reserves remained for the night ahead. The tent covering was inspected from inside for frost accumulation that would indicate air leaks or ventilation issues. If family members woke cold despite correct execution of all the sleeping protocols, it indicated that conditions had exceeded the system's capacity and additional measures were needed. Extra sleeping furs might be added from the family's reserves. The lamp might be burned at higher intensity the following evening to load more heat into the tent's thermal mass. The tent might be repositioned to gain better wind protection or better access to passive heat from sun or rock faces. The flexibility to adapt the system based on outcomes was as important as knowing the baseline techniques. Arctic conditions varied. Some nights were colder than others. Some storms were more severe. Wind patterns shifted. Fuel supplies ran lower or higher than expected. Families that could read the signs and adjust their approach survived. Families that rigidly followed a single approach regardless of conditions sometimes didn't. The knowledge that made this sleeping system work was transmitted entirely through direct experience and observation. Children grew up sleeping in these tents from infancy, experiencing every element of the system from their earliest memories. By the time a young person was responsible for tending the lamp or managing the sleeping arrangements for their own family, they had 15 to 20 years of accumulated experience. They knew by feel what adequate sleeping warmth felt like and what insufficient warmth felt like. They knew by observation what a properly burning lamp looked like versus one that was too high or too low. They knew by experience what frost patterns on tent walls indicated about ventilation. They knew by memory which sleeping positions provided what level of warmth for different family members. This embodied knowledge couldn't be transmitted through written instructions or abstract teaching. It had to be lived. A person who had never experienced sleeping in an Arctic tent at -50°C couldn't be told how to do it successfully. They would lack the sensory reference points and experiential judgment that made the difference between adequate execution and excellent execution. The consequences of poor execution were severe enough that the knowledge transmission was taken seriously. Parents didn't allow children to experiment casually with lamp tending or sleeping arrangement management. The learning was supervised carefully, with adults monitoring every decision and correcting errors before they became dangerous. By the time a young adult was making these decisions independently, they had been through hundreds of nights of guided practice. When modern researchers have attempted to recreate Arctic nomad sleeping systems using authentic materials and techniques, they've consistently found that the systems work exactly as described. Temperatures inside the tent stabilize 40 to 50 degrees warmer than outside temperatures. Properly managed seal oil lamps burn for 8 to 12 hours on remarkably small fuel quantities. The sleeping arrangements maintain adequate warmth for deep sleep even at exterior temperatures that would kill an unprotected person within an hour. But the researchers also consistently report that executing the system correctly requires attention and skill that takes significant time to develop. Managing the lamp to maintain optimal flame without smoking is harder than it looks. Achieving the right ventilation balance takes practice and observation. Positioning people and bedding for maximum warmth requires understanding that comes from experience. The Arctic nomad families who executed this system successfully night after night through entire winters weren't doing anything superhuman. They were applying knowledge that had been refined through thousands of years of evolution, where failures were eliminated by death and successes were preserved and transmitted. Every element of the sleeping system addressed a specific mechanism by which cold killed sleeping people, and every element had been tested through winters severe enough that inadequate solutions resulted in dead families. What Arctic nomads achieved was a complete integration of shelter, heating, insulation, clothing, sleeping arrangements, and overnight monitoring that allowed humans to sleep safely through conditions at the absolute edge of what our species can survive. The tent provided wind protection and moisture management. The lamp provided radiant heating with extreme fuel efficiency. The floor insulation prevented ground heat loss. The clothing and bedding created nested thermal zones. The body clustering multiplied individual heat output into collective warmth. The overnight monitoring ensured the system continued functioning through the most vulnerable hours. Remove any single element and the system degraded toward failure. Inadequate tent site selection meant wind penetration that no amount of bedding could compensate for. Poor lamp management meant inadequate heating or dangerous smoke accumulation. Insufficient floor insulation meant conductive heat loss that undermined all the other measures. Inadequate clothing or bedding meant individual heat loss that body clustering couldn't overcome. Lack of overnight monitoring meant problems developing unnoticed until they became crises. The system worked because it was complete and because it was executed with precision born from generations of experience where imprecision was fatal. That's how Arctic nomads slept in winter tents at temperatures down to -58 degrees Celsius without freezing to death. Not through genetic adaptation that made cold less dangerous to their bodies. Not through mystical connection to the Arctic that outsiders couldn't access. Through knowledge, specific, accurate, comprehensive knowledge about heat, cold, moisture, ventilation, and the human body's needs. Knowledge that was refined through thousands of winters where families either got it right and survived or got it wrong and died. Knowledge that was transmitted from grandmother to mother to daughter, from grandfather to father to son, in an unbroken chain extending back to the first humans who figured out how to survive Arctic winter in portable shelters. Knowledge that represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. Learning to sleep safely through conditions that should be unsurvivable, using nothing but animal skins, seal oil, and understanding. The families sleeping in those tents at -50 degrees Celsius weren't barely clinging to survival. They were sleeping deeply enough to dream, resting thoroughly enough to wake refreshed, maintaining health through months of darkness and cold that would destroy unprepared populations within weeks. The tent and the sleeping system it housed were the foundation that made Arctic life possible, that allowed humans to inhabit the far north year-round, that enabled cultures to develop and thrive in the most extreme environment our species has permanently settled.